Yeah, I think I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you since we're about to begin.
All right, I've dropped the I'm dropping the link to the YouTube into the chat. All right. So I'm going to kick this off, and I wanted to welcome everyone tonight to the latest installment in our Voter Services, Voter Education series. We feel like the more we learn, the better we're going to be able to help and be better able to change and make change in Alabama and help the people who need to get out and vote. And so really appreciate all of you showing up tonight, and we'll go ahead and get started here. I'm going to hand this. I see a hand up. I don't, Nancy, do you need something, or? I think that may be by accident. All right, so tonight's presentation is a presentation to understand the primary elections process in Alabama, and especially understanding our current system that we have in Alabama and what it would mean if we go to a closed primary. And Bryan Lorge, who is working with us on the state board for voting rights restoration, he also works volunteers with the League of Women Voters advocacy team, is going to be the moderator tonight, and he'll introduce our panelist, our speaker, who will be giving us a lot of very important information. Bryan, I'm going to hand it off to you right now.
All right. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today from across Alabama, and any visitors, if we have any from other states. We are very glad you're with us today. My name is Bryan Lorge. I am a member of the League of Women Voters of Alabama. I will be your moderator for tonight's session. If you'd like to invite anyone to watch, this event will be streamed live on YouTube, and the link has been placed in the chat. Also, a recording of this presentation will be put on the League of Women Voters of Alabama Facebook page if anybody wants to look at it at a later time. If you have any questions, please use the chat function that is at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions at any time, but we will hold the questions till the end of the session. If there's time, we'll answer those questions. If not, we will work with our speaker to get follow-up information after the event has ended. This is the second in a series of discussions on voting in Alabama. We did a session in February on barriers to voting in Alabama. This session will be run a little bit differently. We're only going to have one expert on this one. And so we're really focusing more right now on educational. I will do a brief introduction to the Alabama primary process. And then again, our one panelist will talk about open versus closed primaries. The topic of closed primaries in Alabama has been discussed. There is currently no legislation pending. As a result, again, this session is going to be more informational. But the topic of closing primaries is becoming more prevalent in the United States, especially in southern states. Kathy, can you show the one slide for me? Primary elections are covered in the Code of Alabama under Title 17, Elections in Chapter 13. I've went back and reviewed that, and I've highlighted a couple of the interesting sections here to me. Even though the primaries are put on for the parties by the probate judges in the election process, they must follow the rules of general elections. For example, you have to follow registration deadlines, absentee ballot rules. There is no early voting. So even though these are run theoretically for the parties, you have to follow the rules. And also the rules very clearly state a political party does not need to hold a primary, and our speaker will address that in a little while of kind of the history of primaries in Alabama. The process to get on the ballot for primaries is different. The state party chairs certifies the candidates for election, with the exception of county chairs who certify for county positions. So again, the process is handled through the parties, is not handled through the state. In the current law, it's interesting that the code allows parties to restrict who can vote in their primary. However, since Alabama doesn't currently have partisan registration, it's tough to enforce this. So Parties are allowed to set the rules on who can vote in their primary, and they have the option to limit to their primaries, limit it to members of their party. But again, there's no way to enforce that at the polling location. And another part of the thing says parties are allowed to put it on the ballot that you are committing to support the candidates that win the primary election and the general election. Again, this is something that's interesting. It's in the law, but it's very hard to enforce. And the last thing I found interesting, if there's a tie in a party primary, it's up to the state party chair to resolve that tie. So those are just a couple of highlights of what's in the existing law. At this point, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Jeremy Gruber is the Senior Vice President of Open Primaries, a national election reform organization. He is a lawyer, writer, and public policy advocate, and has helped pass over 60 state and federal laws. He has previously worked for the American Civil Liberties Union and several other civil rights organizations. Jeremy is the author of 3 books and dozens of articles and is regularly featured in the media. Received his Juris Doctor, JD, from St. John's University School of Law and a BA in politics from Brandeis University. With this, I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Brian. Good evening, everybody. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, we sure
Yes.
can.
Great. Okay, so we're here to talk about primaries. And before we start, let me just tell you a little bit about my organization, Open Primaries. We were founded in 2009. We're both a 501c4 and 501c3 nonprofit organization. And we work on all aspects of primary election reform, everything from public education to community organizing, to running campaigns, developing leadership, and defending open primaries, as well as building open primaries in states all across the country. So I'm really excited to be with you here tonight to talk to you a little bit about how primaries and work and the difference between open and closed primaries. We have 2 rounds of elections in this country, the primary and the general election. 100 years ago, we only had a general election. And then in the early part of the 20th century, states around the country, including Alabama, started to adopt primary elections. Why? Well, because before we had primary elections in this country, what would happen is that the party leaders and the special interests would get together. They'd choose the candidates. They'd develop the platforms and the agendas. And the people, the American citizens, didn't have a chance to impact any part of the process until they showed up in November. By then it was far too late. Most things had been decided for them. So the people, not the parties, the people forced the parties to begin using primary elections in order for the people to be able to more directly impact candidate selection, the setting of agendas, the prioritization of issues, and other areas. And that's the origin story of primaries today. In fact, ironically, while the parties like to say they're our primaries, the parties actually fought the use of primary elections in this country for decades. It really wasn't only until the 1960s that primary elections came into widespread use. And that's because the parties eventually made peace with the primary, began a new narrative that it was their election when it had been forced upon them. And that's where we are today. So there's every state, as I'm sure most of you know, state election law in this country is set at the state level, and every state is a little different. There's a couple of prominent forms of open primaries that I'm going to talk about, but there are other forms that exist that I'm happy to talk about during the question and answer period. So 38 states in this country, so the overwhelming majority of states in this country, have some form of an open primary. At its very basic form, what an open primary means is that every voter can participate in the first round of elections, the primary. regardless of their partisan affiliation or lack thereof. That's the sort of the basic form of an open primary. And then there are different forms that come from that. So one of the most common forms is the system that's used in Alabama, in which you register with the state of Alabama as a voter, but you do not register with a partisan affiliation. So as far as the state of Alabama is concerned, there are no Republicans, Democrats, independents, libertarians, etc. There are simply voters. And they combine a nonpartisan registration system with a partisan open primary. So they have a Republican Party ballot, as you all know, a Democratic Party ballot, but everybody gets to choose in every election which ballot they want to vote on. And 20 states, including the majority of states throughout the South, have this model of an open primary. The second most common form of an open primary is somewhat similar, but it exists in states that have partisan registration. So in these states, you have to register with the state with your party affiliation or lack thereof. In these states, Republicans can vote in the Republican primary, Democrats can vote in the Democratic primary, and independents can choose which ballot they want to pick and which party they want to vote in each primary election. So only independents in these states get to choose which ballot. Everybody else has to stay in their lane. Now, most cities have a completely open primary as well. 85% of American cities have a fully open primary, including most cities in Alabama. That is the most common form of voting at the municipal level as well. So why are we talking about open versus closed primaries in Alabama? Well, last summer, the Alabama Republican Party passed a resolution to close the primaries. And that resolution passed with a supermajority of votes from the party. And at the time, it was claimed that they would be introducing legislation the first session that came along, which would be the current session that we're in Alabama. That legislation has not yet been introduced. But as we see in other states across the South, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, it is likely coming, whether it's in this session or in the next session. It's almost a certainty that there will be legislation to close the primaries in Alabama. And the movement to close, why are we seeing a movement in Alabama and other states to close the primaries? Well, this is coming out of the more partisan era that we are now living in. Both parties, but particularly obviously the Republican Party, which is the major party in most southern states, wants to have more control over its ballot line. And so it wants to restrict the number of people who can vote in the primary and limit it to the most predictable partisan voters. That's the motivation for wanting to close the primary. So just to give a little bit of background in terms of the legal status of primaries and an open versus closed primaries. This first case at the top, Tastian versus Republican Party, this was a case that came out of Connecticut in which the Republican Party of Connecticut wanted to open its primary. And the state of Connecticut said, well, we have a law that says you can't have an open primary. The Republican Party of Connecticut sued the state. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, every party has a First Amendment right to open its primary. A state can't pass a law to restrict that First Amendment right. It's unconstitutional. Second case that came along was a case called California Democratic Party v. Jones. This was a case that where the Democratic Party of California sued the state of California because they held a very unusual form of primary at the time called a blanket primary, where all the candidates with their were on the ballot. They were still party primaries, but all the candidates were on the ballot and anybody could choose which candidate to vote for regardless of party. The Supreme Court said that's a violation of the First Amendment right of association for the same reason that a party can decide who can vote in a party primary. They can also decide who can't vote in a party primary. And then we have this interesting case of Democratic Party of Hawaii. In this case, Hawaii has the same form of primary that the state of Alabama does, nonpartisan voter registration and an open primary. In this case, the court said, you may have a First Amendment right of association, talking about the parties. But if you don't have partisan voter registration, the fact that any voter picks your ballot is enough to indicate that that voter for that election is intending to affiliate with the party in order to vote in that party's primary. And that's enough to satisfy any constitutional requirements. So this case upheld specifically the form of open primary that is in use in Alabama today. But what all these cases go to show is that once you institute party voter registration, whether it's in Alabama or any other state, the party then has the ability to identify who is a member of that party and who isn't, and can decide who can and can't participate. So once you institute party registration, which is why the Republican Party of Alabama has suggested this would be part of a package of legislation to close the primaries. Once you institute party voter registration, then the parties have the legal authority to show that voters from one party are then voting in another party's primary, and they can choose to close the primary. So this is I thought a really important quote. This is from Republican Mayor David Holt, the mayor of Oklahoma City. And he's talking about what do politicians worry about in America today? Do they worry about winning in the general election? Not much anymore. What they really worry about is the primaries. And that's because the primaries in the United States have become the elections that actually matter over the last 20 years. And that's why elected officials are paying more and more attention to the primaries. It's why the primaries have become more and more important. And it's why the Republican Party of Alabama and many other parties are starting to talk about the rules of the primaries, because the primaries have taken now a much more important role than they ever used to be. And that's due to two major factors that are happening all across the country, including in Alabama. The first is a complete sea change in the way voters think about themselves politically. When I was growing up, I'm sure when most of you were growing up, if you were a family of Democrats, then you were likely going to be a Democrat yourself. That's what how your parents were registered, that's how you were going to register. If you're a family of Republicans, the same thing. And that was how it's been in this country for many, many years. You sort of followed that family tradition. That started to break down really, really quickly with millennials and Gen Z, and now Gen Z voters, which are now the newest generation of voters. And independents have become the largest group of voters in the country. It's not Democrats and it's not Republicans. It's independent voters, people who have left either party, who do not identify with either party, are now the largest group of voters in the country. And we know this by looking at the 30 states, unlike Alabama, the 30 states that combine voter registration with party registration. And when you look at the registration rates in these 30 states with party voter registration, you see some pretty shocking data. In all 30 states, one or both parties are declining in membership. And independent voters are already, today in 2023, the largest or second largest group of voters in a majority of states. And within the next 10 to 15 years, they will be the largest or second largest group of voters in almost every state. Now, we're going to be talking primarily about primaries here, and in a closed primary, the most affected group of voters are independents, because independents are not allowed to vote in closed primaries. So the largest group, once you institute party registration, which is, again, like I said before, the prerequisite to closing the primaries, once you institute party registration in the state of Alabama, you're likely to see a huge growth in independent voters. And as a result, those voters specifically are barred from voting in primaries, period. Closed primaries, sorry, period. But that's not the limit. In the state of Alabama already, if you look through the electoral code, you will find instance after instance where independent voters are barred from other areas of participating in electoral politics. They're barred, for example, in the state of Alabama from serving on election boards. You can't be an independent serving on an election board. And once you start institute party registration, those laws, which have not been particularly well enforced under a nonpartisan voter registration system, will likely come under even more scrutiny. So it's important to talk about, when we're talking about independent voters, who are they? And what are the sort of the largest trends that we see among independent voters? Well, like I said before, the largest group of independent voters are young people. So millennials and Gen Z voters, depending upon the state, well over half are independents, well over half. But it's not just young people. America's veterans, our veterans, about 50% of American veterans are independent. That drops a little bit for the numbers, and for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, it's about 45%. But roughly half of our veterans are independent voters. You know, our military is not a political one, right? And as this is a picture of Rocky Bleier, who, if you're an old football fan, will remember him from the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's a Vietnam War vet, Purple Heart recipient, and a 4-time Super Bowl hero. Rocky Bleier is a big Open Primaries supporter. And what Rocky likes to say is, when you go to fight for America, you don't go to fight for blue America or red America, you go to fight for the United States of America. And many veterans are used to a culture, a non-political culture. And that's how oftentimes they register, or how they see themselves politically. Growing numbers of people of color are independent voters, particularly Asian and Latino voters, but a growing number of African-American voters as well are independent voters. And in a closed primary system, these voters would be completely barred from voting in the first round of elections. Now, like I said, there was 2 major trends that are fueling this overarching focus on primaries in our country and away from the general election. The first, like I said, we just went through, is the growth of independent voters and the move away from aligning oneself with either the Republican or the Democratic Party. But the second is about competition in our general elections. Over the course of the last 30 years or so, we have seen a significant drop in general election competition in this country, which means when you go to vote in November, and this is true from Alaska to Alabama. This is not an Alabama problem. This is an American problem. You see there is less and less competition in the general election. Many times you will vote in a particular contest and you will have an uncontested election with only one person on the ballot. Or you will see a token competitor with 30 to 40% vote differential between the winner and the second place finisher in a race. So when the media likes to pay attention to the horse race elections in this country, and so it props up this idea that we have, real competitive elections with a lot of, choices coming down to the wire. Those are actually the exceptions. The rule are elections that are less and less competitive. That means that the real choices, where the real decision-making happens and where the real candidate selection that will go on to become your elected representative happens, is in the primary. So I wanted to take a little look at what that looks like in the state of Alabama specifically, so you can appreciate just how uncompetitive general elections are. So this is a look at the 2022, so the most recent general election races for state Senate and state House. So you can see these numbers pretty much speak for themselves. In the Senate, there wasn't a single race in the Alabama Senate that was competitive, meaning that there wasn't a single race where the first and second place finishers were within 5% of each other. Over half of races in both houses were uncontested. So in over half of races, when you went to vote in November, there was one person on the ballot and only one person on the ballot. But look at these virtually uncontested numbers. And if you look at the key, those are races where the second place finisher was far, far, far in the distance of the first place winner, close to 40% about 40% on each side. So you're looking at roughly 90% of races where there was literally no choice. 90% of races for state house, literally no choice in the general election. So I wanted to show what that looks like in one specific race. So this is what it looks like for a Republican voter in Birmingham. Truth be told, this is what it looks like for a Democratic voter just about anywhere else. But this is what it looks like for a Republican voter in Birmingham. 2022, Representative Neil Rafferty wins an uncontested general election in both 2018 and in 2022. But look at the 2022 election. Representative Plump wins in an uncontested but a very competitive primary. In District 55 in 2022, the only place where you could impact who your representative would be in that primary. Similarly, and on the Senate side, all the general election races were completely uncontested. This is the norm in Alabama. Truth be told, Alabama is a little bit worse than most of the country. If you look at these general numbers, the average that I tend to see, and it's still pretty awful, probably around 40% uncontested and around 10% competitive. So these are obviously worse numbers, but we're already bad no matter what state you're in this country. And I just want to make clear something else. So obviously there's been a lot of really important pushback to the recent redistricting rules. Then we're now, of course, waiting for a Supreme Court ruling on that. And that's a really important fight. That's not the fight I'm talking about here today. But I want to be clear, when you look at these numbers from before redistricting, slightly better, only slightly better still pretty uncompetitive. So elections have been uncompetitive in the state of Alabama for some time. Redistricting didn't change that much. What it did was change who is, it moved people around to a degree where certain people were, of course, shut out in overwhelming numbers, and that's what's being challenged. But overall competitiveness for voters has been pretty dismal, both before and after redistricting. I want to just give a little bit of background to what's happening, not just across the South, but across other parts of the country as well. Alabama is by no means alone in that where one of the parties is trying to close the primaries. There are efforts underway in a dozen states around the country, primarily, but not exclusively in the South, to close the primaries and shut out voters. We've been running defense campaigns for the last 7 or 8 years to defeat bills to close the primaries. And no state has successfully closed its primary in the last 10 years. But one state closed its primary about 12 years ago. That's the state of Idaho, which was the last state to close its primary. And if you follow politics in Idaho, not that you would, but if you ever pick up a paper and read about some of the most partisan politics you'll ever read about, it's likely coming out of the state of Idaho. Politics in Idaho, since they closed their primary and shut out voters, have become so partisan that they're now developing litmus tests for party voters who are allowed to vote in the primary, but they're developing litmus tests as to who is an appropriate Republican and who is not an appropriate Republican, and trying to shut out Republicans from the Republican primary deemed not to be Republican enough. So this is the slippery slope you start to go to when you start to shut people out and start to partisanize the primary elections. Like I said, this is happening. Efforts are underway in a number of states to try to do this. And if successful, we're talking about potentially millions of voters that would be shut out of the most meaningful elections in the country now, which are, of course, the primary elections. So I wanted to just sort of talk a little bit about the difference between open primaries and closed primaries and what that experience looks like. Well, in a closed primary, who can vote? Well, only registered Republicans and registered Democrats in each other's primaries. Now, as I said before, once you start to institute party registration, you start to find that the largest group of voters are actually independents. And when they are shut out of the primaries, it means that the only people voting are the more partisan voters. So what happens to the candidates? The candidates, as you would expect them to, start to only talk to and reflect the viewpoints of the most partisan voters. So closed primaries tend to push legislators to take even more partisan positions, as you would expect them to, because those are the voters who elect them. And because, as we said before, competition in the general election has become so rare, those are the only voters they have to pay attention to throughout the entire election cycle, are the partisan primary voters in a closed primary. So of course, independent voters are shut out in closed primaries, and predominantly the groups that have a very large share of independent voter identification, like young voters. And the rates go down. And I'll show a graph in a second, but open primary states have higher voter participation, period. All the numbers bear this out, and the Bipartisan Policy Center just came out with a big report. I'll show it in a second. Participation goes down in a closed primary state, as you would expect to. You shut more people out, you don't let them vote, participation goes down, both not just among the people shut out, but even among the people that are technically allowed to vote because their choices start to diminish. What do open primaries do? Well, at their very simplest in the state of Alabama is they let all voters vote, period. And that means that voters who identify as independent can vote. Party voters or people who identify, because of course you don't have party registration in Alabama, but party voters have more choice. So if you're like the slide I showed before, if you may see yourself as a Republican or conservative in Birmingham, but if you want to actually have any impact on who represents you, you might want to pick up a Democratic ballot because that's the only one that matters. And the same thing holds true for someone who might identify as a Democrat in a Republican-dominated district. An open primary forces candidates and politicians to be more broadly representative, because when everybody votes, you represent everybody, and you have to modify your positions to be more broadly appealing. And then finally, and this is important, when I talked about the history of where open primaries came from, or where primaries came from, right? Primaries were created by the American people to be part of the candidate selection process. These are public elections. Part of the challenge we have when talking about primaries versus the rules of primaries being different than the rules of the general election is that most voters don't appreciate that they are different, because the experience of most voters in this country is you go, whether you vote in the primary or the general election, you are going into the same public building. You're voting on the same publicly owned machine. You see the same poll workers you see in the general election. The entire experience of voting in the primary is identical to the general election because it is identical. It's a taxpayer, publicly funded and administered election. So when you go to close the primaries, you are shutting out not just voters, but you're shutting out voters who paid for those elections and are not allowed to participate. This is, like I mentioned, and I'm happy to share it with those people who are interested in more information. The Bipartisan Policy Center just came out with a report about 2 weeks ago, studying open versus closed primaries in states around the country. And they found that states with open primaries have higher voter participation across the board. So, I've been mostly talking about open versus closed primaries in terms of the theory, how they work, right? The theory of how they work. But I wanted to take just a quick moment to talk about what it would look like if the state of Alabama, or any state for that matter, were to actually pass legislation to adopt partisan voter registration and close the primaries from an implementation point of view. So remember, if right now in Alabama, everybody is registered with the state as a voter and only as a voter, not with any party affiliation. So in order to change every voter's registration in the state of Alabama, in order to close the primaries and institute party registration, there would have one of two things would have to happen. They would either A, have to spend a lot of money to thoughtfully go through and re-register every voter with a party affiliation in a somewhat onerous, but hopefully thoughtful process to make sure that every voter registration is up to date with party affiliation, so that, or lack thereof, so that they are prepared to vote in the next primary election. The chances of that happening are close to nothing. So what is more likely to happen? What is more likely to happen is what happened in Idaho, which was the last state we know that closed their primaries. In Idaho, what they did was they simply said, whichever ballot you pick in the next primary election is the party registration that we are going to register with you for the state in perpetuity. And it's going to be up to you to change that in the future. So practically, what's that going to mean? It's going to mean that voters, if Alabama were to institute a closed primary, the next primary election season where this was in place, voters would show up to vote, and they would be told that they would that they were being registered with a party, and it would be up to the poll workers to deal with the consequences of the voter reaction to that. position. And it would be chaos at the polls like it was in Idaho, because voters won't like it. At least many voters won't like it. And all the voters that don't show up for that particular primary, well, it's a question as to whether they'll be registered at all, and what process is in place for those voters. So it would require likely a very chaotic process that would likely disenfranchise even more voters than would be eventually shut out in a closed primary, as by virtue of the process that they would have to put in place to ensure compliance. Then you have the issue of, what does the state do with that information? The state of Alabama has never had to hold people's personal political affiliation information. That raises privacy concerns. How is that information held? How is it used? What's done with it? Those questions have not been addressed or even suggested to be addressed by the folks who are challenging whether or not there should be a closed primary in the state of Alabama. And like I said before, this wouldn't just affect participation in the primary. There are statutes in the Alabama Electoral Code right now that, once they institute party registration, will limit independent voters from being able to participate in other areas of the election machinery. And finally, and we know this from many of the states that we worked in just this year, during hearings on bills to close the primary in other states, voters don't want to join a party when they're not members of a party. This idea that it's a simple thing to join a party that you may or may not have a strong affiliation with, the party suggests it's a simple thing. The voters have very different ideas. And this is why we're seeing such a large rise in voter non-affiliation with the parties, because more and more people are seeing less and less of themselves in the agendas of either party. And while they vote with one party or the other, we only have two choices on the ballot. They don't necessarily see themselves staunchly in one bucket or the other, and they certainly don't want the state labeling them as such. So that's an additional challenge. Like I said, we've been working all across the country to stop efforts to close the primaries where legislation has been introduced. These are some things that happened just this year. In Arkansas, we with our local partner, Common Ground Arkansas, we were actually able to stop the Republican Party from passing a change to their agenda endorsing closed primaries. So we didn't actually see legislation in Arkansas as a result. We worked in Tennessee, probably the most active state on this debate this whole year. There were 4 separate bills this session in the state of Tennessee to close the primaries. All of them had multiple hearings in the state legislature. And we worked very closely hand in hand with the Tennessee League of Women Voters, who helped lead this effort. I have to really give my hats off to Debbie and the entire membership and leadership of the Tennessee League of Women Voters, who worked really tirelessly to defeat these closed primary bills, including, but certainly not limited to, testifying against them. And in Mississippi, again, through a coalition of local groups, we were able to stop efforts to close the primaries. Why? Well, let's be honest. These are all very strong one-party states, as is Alabama. The debate over open versus closed primaries is a debate, at least in the South, it's a debate within the Republican Party. In other parts, it's states. I just got done running a campaign in New Mexico, which is a very Democrat-focused state. There, the debate is entirely within the Democratic Party. So this is not a Republican or a Democrat issue by any means. But obviously in the state of Alabama, the real debate is between the party itself. And there's a real debate within the Alabama Party, as there has been in the Tennessee Republican Party, the Mississippi Republican Party, et cetera, over how they want to relate to voters, whether they want to be more expansive, because let's be honest, it's the Republican Party in the state of Alabama is doing just fine. Why do they want to shut out voters when they're doing just fine? Well, that's an open question for members of the party themselves, and that debate is happening within the party. So that's where we are. We're working, like I said, all across the country, not just to pass open primaries, but to defend open primaries. And that's why I'm here speaking to you about open versus closed primaries. We are expecting, whether it's in this session or a future session, to see an effort to close the primaries. And I hope this was a helpful conversation, and I'm happy to continue to take your questions, and we can get into this even deeper. Thank you.
All right, Jeremy, thank you very much. It was a great presentation, and if I can read my notes, there are a couple of questions I think have come up. Some of them I think you've already touched on, but there was one question came up about ranked choice voting. It's particularly in Alaska. Can you address that? How does that affect this at all?
Sure. So some of you may have heard of ranked choice voting. It's a form of ballot tabulation that is different than most states use, and it's getting a little bit of traction around the country, particularly at the municipal level. But 2 states, Maine and Alaska, have both adopted it at the state level. Ranked choice voting, the way I like to talk about it is ranked choice voting is about how you vote. But it's not about who votes. Open primaries is about who gets to vote. Ranked choice voting doesn't change who can and can't participate in a primary or any election. It's simply a voter tabulation system, and its proponents certainly believe that it makes elections more fair, more representative. I think that's a very important and active debate. But it's not about whether or not voters can and can't participate in the elections at any level. That's what open primaries is a voter rights issue. It's about who can and can't participate in a publicly funded election like the primary. So there's a little bit of similarities in terms of some of the promises of a better politic that come out of both issues, but they're fundamentally come from very different places.
All right. Thank you. There's also was a question in there about federal law and requiring primaries. Does federal law have anything to say about this?
Well, as most of you know, election law is primarily, although not exclusively, set at the state level. There is no requirement federally that you have a primary. Almost every state has a primary. It used to be much more common to have caucuses, but we know, we're starting to see caucuses become less and less common, and now there's a couple of states that still use them, but even those states are starting to question the caucus method. So we're likely to have primaries in most states to come. Certainly, we don't have to have them. Louisiana is an interesting example. Louisiana doesn't actually have a primary at all. Louisiana has they start with the general election, and then they have a runoff. And some people talk about it like an open primary, but it's a little like an open primary in the sense you have 2 elections and everybody gets to vote in them. But Louisiana does it a little bit differently than everybody else. Some people call it the Louisiana system. But primaries, 47 states have primaries, and they're likely to stay. There's always this, sometimes, Brian, the parties will say, well, we're just gonna get rid of the primary and go back to 100 years ago to party leaders picking candidates. Here's the problem. As I said before, primaries are publicly funded. So the moment either party says we are going to reject the primary system is the moment whatever they put in its place, they're going to be on the hook up for financially. Most state parties don't have the resources to year after year pay for an alternative system. And certainly they aren't interested in the backlash from voters of being shut out entirely from choosing candidates. So it's usually it's an empty threat in most cases. Sometimes party leaders will throw it about, but we're not anticipating that being a real problem anywhere in this country.
Okay. And there was a question, and I'm going to ask kind of general, but has to do with what have you seen as far as rules, if they allow you to change party registration, how far in advance, how's that stuff generally handled? What
Yeah,
kind of
that's a
effect
great,
does that have?
that's a great question. One of the issues, and I'm going to put this for next time I talk about this. One of the issues that the state of Alabama would have to address if they were to institute a closed primary is change of registration rules. Right now, when you're just a voter in the state of Alabama, you don't have to worry about that. But in states with partisan voter registration, they have a whole panoply of rules about how and when you can change your registration from one party to another, or to become an independent voter. And there had been a push for a long time to liberalize those laws, to make it easier and easier to change party registration. Those laws are now in a partisan environment also under attack. And so states are trying to either have or are trying to extend those registration rules to make it difficult. So what does that look like? Probably the most famous example was the 2016 primary election in the state of New York. New York, until recently, had some of the worst voter registration rules in the country. New York is, and I live in New York, and New York has by far some of the worst election rules of any state in the country, by far. But specifically to voter registration, what happened, if you might remember this in 2016, when Donald Trump ran for the first time for the Republican nomination in the state of New York, his home state, his own children couldn't vote for him in the primary. Why? Because New York had a rule that you couldn't change your party registration up to 8 months before the primary. Well, 8 months before the New York primary, nobody knew who the candidates were, including Donald Trump. So you had no reason or idea of why you would even think of changing your party registration. This also happened on the Democratic side, because remember, Bernie Sanders was an independent, and Bernie Sanders ran in the Democratic primary. And there were a lot of Republicans in the state of New York and independents in the state of New York that really liked Bernie Sanders and they wanted to vote for him. And they couldn't, because he became a candidate after the rules to change the primaries had already, to change your voter registration had been settled. So these rules are meant to keep people out of the business of changing your mind about about a party and whether, and trying to force you to stick with your partisan affiliation for life as if it's a badge. It's a badge of something. But more and more voters don't like what they're seeing from either party. They want to be more mobile. They want to try something different, and these rules are often meant to stop them from doing that. And you're likely going to see a whole fight over this in the state of Alabama if the primaries are ever closed.
Okay. And there's another question that says, what kind of groups were part of the coalition in Mississippi that managed to defeat the move to closed primaries?
Yeah, so you tend to see, primarily voting rights groups, which tend to come from the left. But here's the thing with primary reform. It's a really interesting issue. And I come from the civil rights world. I've worked on a lot of different issues. I've never actually encountered an issue that cut across so many political lines. So the coalition that defeated it in Mississippi and the types of people that work to stop the closing of the primaries, these are conservatives, they're liberals, they're moderates, they're independents. We work with people all over the political spectrum on the issue of open versus closed primaries, because in the end, this is really just an issue of fundamental fairness, and fundamental fairness is something that most Americans appreciate, most Americans support. And so you see the issue of open versus closed primaries cut across a lot of political lines that many other issues don't. And I think that's a really important distinction around the primary reform issue that sometimes gets missed in this sort of such heavily partisanized climate that we tend to see everything as blue versus red, when this issue is something quite different.
And I think that is all the questions I saw come up in the chat. And I guess if anyone else, we have a little bit of time left. If anybody has any questions, they can raise their hand or whatever, we can recognize them. I'm going to ask Kathy and of our other co-hosts if they see anything. And if not, I'm going to just go ahead.
I'm looking. I
have a question.
Linda Varon.
Okay. If someone wants to challenge an incumbent, it seems like they're better off to run as an independent. Like if you're in that's a more Republican district, rather than running as a Democrat, run as an independent. I mean, there are lots of barriers to getting on the ballot as an independent, but.
Yeah, now that's possibly true. I think, now remember, the open primary versus closed primary issue is an issue about voters, not candidates, in terms of access. It's about which voters can and which voters can't participate as a voter. But I think you're raising an important question, and that is that what is it going to look like in the state of Alabama or other states if a closed primary is instituted? You're going to see a lot of pressure on voters to choose to affiliate as a Republican in order to participate in what in most districts will be the only election that matters, the Republican primary. And a lot of people don't like that. And it's going to be a very uncomfortable period of time in the state of Alabama. But think about the people most likely not to do that. Right now, as we mentioned before, there's a major case in the Supreme Court about how rules of elections in the state of Alabama are shutting out certain groups of people. Well, you're going to see the same type of constrictions in terms of voters shut out as a result of a closed primary if that were to be instituted. There will be the voters who have a meaningful choice in the election, and there will be the voters who are totally shut out, either directly or indirectly disenfranchised from choosing their representatives, and their representatives will have no incentive whatsoever to connect with them, to listen to them, to legislate in their best interests. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but if Alabama is to institute closed primaries, politics in the state are likely to get much more partisan, and voter access to honest representation much less likely. And that's why it's so important to be vigilant around this debate of open versus closed primaries. The good news is that, like I said, this is not a partisan issue, and there is plenty of support for keeping the primary open within the Republican Party of Alabama, both among leadership and among just regular members. But there are elements of the Alabama Republican Party that want to close the primary and shut voters out. And we need to not just organize among ourselves, but organize among voters of all political persuasions in the state of Alabama to let the political leadership know where they stand, and let them know that they don't want a move to a closed primary. It will be bad for the state of Alabama. It will be bad for the Republican Party, whether they appreciate it or not. Again, my purpose in being here and presenting today is just to offer our support as this issue develops in the state of Alabama. And we're more than excited and interested to work with you all to organize, to speak out, to educate, and to fight back if a bill is ever introduced.
I'm sorry, I have one more question. Is the lawsuit that you're talking about the one that Mark Elias is doing with Richard Rocco and it's going to the Supreme Court?
The Milligan case that's before they already did oral arguments. The Jeremy case, yeah.
Okay. I think that for the people that are on the call, they are looking for witnesses to give depositions if you're in Jefferson County in certain districts. I could put my email in the chat and you could email me if you're willing to be a witness. Can I do that?
So I'm not sure, Linda, what you're talking about.
Okay, I'll look it up and I'll get it to you guys and you
Okay.
can send it out, okay?
Okay. All right.
I did see in the chat, Brian, I don't know if you want me to address it about jungle primaries. How do they fit in this conversation?
Yes, if you could, please.
Yeah, so I don't like to use the term jungle primaries. It's a pejorative used by opponents of primary reform, but jungle primaries or the more appropriate name are nonpartisan primaries, are very similar to the form of election used at the municipal level that I talked about earlier. 4 states have some form of a nonpartisan primary. Those states are Alaska, Washington State, California, and Nebraska for the unicameral, their state legislative races. In a nonpartisan primary, it's very different from the forms of primaries that I talked about earlier. You do not have a party primary. You get rid of the party primary. You no longer have a Republican Party primary or a Democratic Party primary. You simply have one public primary, one election, one ballot. All the candidates are on that ballot. All the voters get to vote, and they get to choose from all the candidates. And the top vote getters move on to the general election. They are a much more inclusive form of primary. A handful of states have adopted them, and a number of states from everywhere from Oklahoma to South Dakota to Oregon are exploring ways of reforming their primaries to move away from a partisan model and to a nonpartisan model. I don't expect that to be in the cards for the state of Alabama anytime soon, but it's certainly an important conversation about not just how do we defend what we have in Alabama, but how do we build bigger and better and more inclusive and more fair and more representative. And certainly that's an important conversation as well.
I would like to just mention that a lot of times we're seeing there's only like one candidate for a political party running. When you have a primary, I know this is stating the obvious, I guess, but that we'll have 3 or 4 candidates in one party and maybe one person running on the other political party. And so that political party is not having a primary. If they've only got one candidate, they go straight to the general election. And I wanted to point that out because we have a lot of that in Alabama, that people who, they go to vote on the primary and they don't see their candidate or who they thought was going to be on their ballot, but they're not there because they're not being primaried. They're just going straight to general. And that's I guess that gets back to the not competitive. They don't have anybody else running in their party, except they've had one candidate.
All
So,
right. If not, I'm just gonna try to wrap up. I thank Jeremy very much for this presentation. In preparing for this in my research, I think Jeremy made two very important points I'm going to try to wrap up. And one is the voter participation obviously goes down in closed primaries for a number of reasons Jeremy talked about. And when you go back and look at the 2022 primary for senator, especially in Alabama, the runoff ended up with about 10% turnout. So you're talking about very, very few people in the state selecting the senator, the U.S. senator. And the other one is that Jeremy touched on. I think it tends to drive the candidates to the extremes of either party, because that's that's who's in the closed primaries. And again, I think what we're seeing across the board is that's not what we want. So with that, I thank Jeremy, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kathy to wrap up.
all right. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate this. This has been a very, very good educational opportunity for us. And Jeremy, I appreciate you and your organization for coming and talking to us about the primary system and what we might expect with closed primaries. If we see that legislation coming into Alabama, then people who are on board tonight will have learned a lot about what it could mean if we close the primaries. I did want to explain how the league operates a little bit to folks online. The League of Women Voters has impact on positions that is determined at the national level. We have conventions where delegates bring in proposals that the delegates from across the country vote on. And if you go and Google it, League of Women Voters Impact on Positions, it's a sizable book with really small print, and you can buy it on Amazon. But if you go in there, it covers the waterfront on a lot of topics, including elections. There's a lot of detail in there, but they can't cover everything unless there's been a study. And then if, for example, right now, there's no position in our National League of Women Voters position on closed primaries, open versus closed. And so what we've had tonight is an educational opportunity, because, unless we can understand the problem, we as a state of Alabama, we can come up with our own positions. We don't have a position on this topic either in our Alabama positions. One of the things we're considering is it something that we need to study? And if we do that, then members of the League of Women Voters, this is sort of like democracy at work. Each of the local leagues would have an opportunity to discuss and come to a consensus on whether or not we want to support open versus closed, or we may choose, the consensus of the group may be that it's not either one. There may be another version. You may be seeing this at the convention. This is something something that delegates would be asked to vote on. So, and if we do, the delegates, basically need to understand that this is a very intense effort. It would be a lot of work. We've got some discussion to have within our state board on whether we feel like we've got the capacity to do this study. So it's all about the League of Women Voters depends on our volunteers. And so, if we go down this path to choose to study this issue, to develop our own position on whether we oppose or support it, then it'll be very important for the whole country, because the National League has said if a state league chooses to study this, then they could pick it up and look at it for adoption at the national level. So anyway, I hope I haven't confused you. I just wanted you to understand that tonight's discussion, we don't have a position that we can adopt at the Alabama level, but this is something that obviously we're going to have to deal with. And so I appreciate, Jeremy, you bringing the information to us, because knowledge is power. And this is part of how we're better able to understand the issues and try to develop our positions. And with that being said, I wanted to point out that we've got additional forums coming up. We'll be announcing them through our newsletter and through emails. If you want to get more information when we send out the video for tonight, let us know and we'll add you to the mailing list. If you want to join the League of Women Voters, we'd love that too. So with that said, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Brian. And Doug, I appreciate your helping us organize this as well, Doug Boulder. So Doug and Jeremy, and we'll talk again later. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.